At 2 a.m. in the bone-chilling waters of a Maine river, Zeth, an amphibious commander of the Galactic Empire, broke the surface like a silent phantom. His state-of-the-art stealth-scale armor flawlessly deflected all ambient light beneath the black water. His wrist-mounted neurotoxin projector hummed, fully spun up and ready to deploy a wide-spectrum subjugation agent into the inland waterways of this primitive rock. However, barely a half-second after his respiratory valve cleared the surface, the pitch-black red pine tree line erupted. Dozens of high-output, 10,000 lumen spotlights punched through the darkness. The glare hit with the force of a physical blow, instantly blinding Zeth's hypersensitive nocturnal pupils. His tactical HUD shrieked in alarm as his optic nerves were seared into a state of agonizing whiteout. Immediately following the blinding light came the violent, unmistakable clack of Remington shotguns racking shells, echoing down both sides of the riverbank. Before Zeth could discharge a single microgram of his neuroagent, a massive, fine mesh dip net reeking of rancid river mud slammed down from above, brutally trapping his entire head and tactical antennae. An old, bloodshot-eyed human wearing chest waders trudged right into the freezing water. He jammed his gun barrel directly against Zeth's forehead. Reeking of cheap tobacco, the old man spat. "Think you're gonna poach my glass eels, you son of a bitch? I don't give a damn what kind of fancy-ass wetsuit you're wearing. I'm breaking both your legs tonight, or my name ain't Smith." Zeth's optic nerves spasmed violently from the photonic burns. His vision was a mess of lingering, incandescent blotches, rendering him unable to even focus on the primitive ballistic weapon pressed against his cranium. Pure combat reflex took over. He kicked hard with his hind limbs and slammed a digit onto the ignition switch of his hip-mounted hydro-thruster, desperate to drag himself back down to the riverbed. The rushing water instantly compacted the fine mesh against him. Under the hydraulic pressure, tens of thousands of cheap nylon threads wedged themselves right into the micron-level biomimetic seams of his stealth armor. The previously fluid scales deadlocked on the spot, unable to refract even a single photon. His translucent camouflage shattered, exposing a massive, writhing black silhouette in the water. The thruster's turbine had barely hit peak RPM when it sucked in a massive tangled wad of netting. The alloy blades chewed into the nylon, spitting out a shower of friction sparks. The entire power unit let out a muffled, thunderous pop before seizing up completely. The acrid stench of scorched plastic flooded into his rebreather mask via the circulation system. Panic set in. He thrashed his limbs wildly, trying to break free, but every movement only forced the current to draw the net tighter. Power failure warnings lit up his HUD in a cascade of flashing red. Even the fully prepped neurotoxin projector on his wrist was hogtied so thoroughly by the mesh that he couldn't raise it a millimeter. The freezing river water seeped through the breached tactical suit, turning his precision hydraulic joints stiff and sluggish. Mustering the last dregs of his strength, he activated his helmet's universal translation module. The instant the frequency calibrated, a piercing, ear-splitting warning klaxon, a sound completely alien to Earth, blasted from his external speakers across the river. Old Man Smith didn't even blink. Running on 36 hours of pure, unadulterated sleep deprivation, his bloodshot eyes didn't waver. He gripped the stock of his Remington, raised his arm and brought the butt of the shotgun crashing down hard right toward the source of the noise. A dull thud echoed as the stock slammed into the weird-looking helmet. The ear-piercing alien warning instantly fractured into a mess of static, fizzing and popping like a busted transistor radio. Smith spat a glob of chewing tobacco, his voice carrying the gritty, unforgiving chill of the Maine coast. "The hell kind of ghost-hunting bullshit is this? You try to poach eels on my watch, and you think some funky noise is gonna scare me off?" He gripped the 6-foot aluminum handle of the dip net with both hands, his frost-bitten knuckles turning pale blue from the strain. The submerged nylon mesh was digging ruthlessly into the trespasser's stealth scales. The harder the bastard thrashed, the tighter the net constricted, leaving zero room for escape. The ankle-deep muck sucked at his rubber chore boots with a wet, squelching sound every time he took a step back. The veins bulged on Smith's forearms, straining the sleeves of his faded flannel shirt as he forcibly dragged the heavy iron-like poacher right out of the waist-deep ice water. A massive splash of muddy, freezing water erupted as he heaved the catch onto the bank. Giving the guy absolutely zero time to recover, Smith used his backward momentum to whip the dip net violently onto the mudflat behind him. The alien, the net, his tactical suit, and a half-gallon of rotting weeds and ice shards sailed through the air in a dripping, humiliating arc before slamming heavily onto the black mud right next to the empty eel baskets. The massive impact gouged a 1.5-foot deep crater into the semi-frozen mud. Freezing water and rotting kelp forcefully injected themselves into the breached seams of Zeth's stealth armor. His visual sensors, already half-fried by the high beams, immediately flooded his HUD with cascading red error codes, incapable of rendering a single piece of effective telemetry. He writhed instinctively, which only drove the nylon threads deeper into his outer scales. The dead underwater thruster emitted a series of agonizing, structural cracking sounds. Even the neurotoxin projector embedded in his armor clicked sickeningly as it was forced out of alignment. A mud-caked rubber boot stomped down into the muck, just a half-inch from his head. The coarse stench of tobacco and freezing eel slime crept in through the helmet's compromised seals. Zeth couldn't even process the human raising his arms, but he distinctly heard the crisp, mechanical zip, zip, zip of ratcheting plastic. 2 heavy-duty, industrial black zip ties, each as wide as a pinky finger, wrapped around his sides. Smith's hands, rough as 80 grit sandpaper, effortlessly cranked Zeth's net-tangled arms squarely behind his back. Zeth's precision biomimetic exoskeleton had been optimized for zero-gravity environments. It wasn't even equipped with heavy-load structural reinforcements for high-G worlds, rendering him completely devoid of brute force for resistance. The second he tried to straighten his arms, the one-way locking teeth of the zip ties bit viciously into his scale seams. The pressure sensors in his shoulder plates immediately spiked into the red critical zone. The nylon bindings cinched tighter, locking his wrists behind his back as if they were welded together. He couldn't move his fingertips a fraction of an inch. The elite amphibious infiltration commander of the Galactic Empire was now lying like a gutted fish on a tidal flat, completely stripped of even the strength to lift his head by 2 crude strips of plastic. Buried in 1/2 meter of rotting black mud, Zeth's helmet loudspeaker was completely trashed, rendering him unable to spit out a single syllable of alien dialogue. The 1/2 functioning core chip he had left frantically scanned for available modules and finally snagged onto the helmet's built-in short-range land transmitter. Hidden in the innermost shock-absorbing layer of the armor, it had miraculously survived the blunt force trauma. Zeth routed every single ounce of unexpended backup power directly into the transmitter, completely ignoring the fact that the overloading current was actively slagging the last intact circuit pins. A maximum priority, hard wake-up, encrypted pulse instantly pierced the murky water, shooting straight down to the squad's communication terminal lurking on the riverbed. 4 elite amphibious operatives of the Galactic Empire, currently dug into the mud layer in active stealth mode, simultaneously received a maximum tier rescue alert on their terminals. They instantly aborted their cloaking standbys. Their hydro-thruster turbines engaged in unison, surging toward the riverbank with a roaring wave of propulsion. Zeth's completely blind vision was filled with burned-in-white afterimages, but through the land's coordinate feedback, he could clearly see 4 tactical red dots closing in on his position at maximum velocity. His fraying sanity finally managed to claw back a singular shred of logic. Old Man Smith's earpiece radio suddenly blasted with static, followed by the roaring voice of Old Tom, his river patrol partner of 6 years, nearly blowing out the speaker membrane. "We got more in the river. Got a handful of shadows Russian right for your boots." The unlit hand-rolled cigarette dangling from his lips dropped into the mud. His knuckles were still slick with alien armor lubricant from when he bashed the intruder's helmet. A raspy, cold chuckle rolled up from his throat. His calloused palm accurately gripped the black rubber handle of the heavy electrical switchbox behind him, and with a flick of his wrist, he slammed it down hard. A bank of 20 second-hand car batteries lined up on the shore emitted a simultaneous, heavy hum. An overloaded electrical current surged violently through a fine wire mesh buried half a meter underwater. The nearly invisible grid was instantly charged with tens of thousands of volts. Tiny, dense, purplish-blue electric arcs crackled and danced beneath the muddy yellow surface, kicking up a layer of micro-bubbles that smelled distinctly of rust. Smith spat into his palms, grabbed his 12-gauge shotgun resting against his pickup's tire, and racked it with a heavy clack. He unceremoniously ground the toe of his boot right across his prisoner's helmet brim, smearing a half-pound of muck dead center onto the alien's blown-out night vision sensors. On the tactical HUD of the alien communications officer, Commander Zeth's coordinates were frantically pulsing a low battery red alert. The comms officer and 3 assault troopers pushed their hydro thrusters to critical mass, their frictionless stealth scales gliding through the freezing river. They were less than 2 meters from breaching the surface. The point troopers' toes were the first to graze the algae-covered wire mesh. 10,000 volts of high voltage instantly punched right through the biomimetic insulation layer wedged between his stealth scales. Purplish-blue arcs of electricity slithered up the armor's articulated seams like a nest of screaming vipers. All 4 elite amphibious operatives suffered simultaneous, catastrophic helmet alarms. The ear-splitting buzz stabbed painfully into their optic nerves. Before the remaining 3 could even yank their thruster directional sticks to take evasive action, the highly conductive river water interlinked the current into an inescapable web, violently locking all 4 bodies in place. The comms officer watched helplessly as the green stealth efficiency, 100% text on his HUD, exploded into red alerts. Every single adaptive camouflage chip popped and fractured under the overloaded current. The 4 bodies, previously entirely invisible in the murky water, suddenly popped into existence as if someone had thrown invisible ink on them. They looked like 4 electrified, translucent jellyfish, with blinding blue sparks violently jumping from their joint seams. Their muscles spasmed uncontrollably, stripping them of the strength to even reach for their neurotoxin projectors. Their ankles became hopelessly tangled in the wire mesh the harder they struggled. Massive, rust-scented bubbles violently breached the surface, pushing the web of dancing, purplish-blue electric arcs straight up to the mirror-smooth surface of the water. The entire stretch of the river erupted in a blinding blue-white net of light, crashing directly into the line of sight of every eel poacher on the bank. Smith's knuckles were still locked tight on the plastic switch handle, the blue-white arcs reflecting off his bloodshot eyes. The previously scattered radio chatter instantly erupted into a chaotic storm of profanity. Over a dozen eel fishermen, who had been sitting around a fire by the red pines, jumped up like bears with their tails stepped on, kicking over their beer cans in the process. 8 Ford F-150s parked on the mudflat fired up their ignitions almost in unison. The low growl of the diesel engines shook the ice crystals right off the pine branches. Nearly 100 watts of xenon headlights simultaneously snapped to the river, turning the pitch-black waterway as bright as a noonday parking lot, illuminating the mud patterns a full 3 inches underwater. Smith grabbed his sawed-off Remington, flicked his wrist to pump the action, and chambered a brass-cased shell with a satisfying clack. He aimed over the water and unleashed the first blast, the shockwave of the buckshot sending a spray of shattered silver skipping across the surface. "Fuck you, you New Jersey scumbags." Bearded old Tom, standing in the bed of his pickup, pinned the closest twitching alien shadow with a handheld spotlight, spit flying from his chin. "You even think 'bout touching a single pound of my glass eels. I'll strip your bones and use 'em for bait." The alien comms officer's sensors were continually throwing red errors, totally blinded by the xenon headlights, while the residual numbness of the current gnawed at every joint of his biomimetic skeleton. The comms officer watched as his 3 assault troopers gritted their teeth, expending every ounce of strength to control their violently twitching arms. Their fingers trembled like reeds in a hurricane, barely managing to unhook the deployment clasps on their hip-mounted neurotoxin canisters. 3 heavy splashes broke the water from above as several iron cans, wrapped tightly in black waterproof tape, plummeted through the murky water straight to the riverbed. No flash, no bubbles. A point-blank underwater shockwave instantly detonated, the concussive force churning the surrounding sediment into a muddy tidal wave that slammed mercilessly into the alien's stealth scales. The shockwave completely shattered the toxin pipeline interfaces on the 3 troopers' hips. The emerald green, highly lethal liquid dispersed wildly into the water like thick ink, instantly enveloping their stunned bodies. Their tense limbs instantly seized. All struggling ceased immediately, and even the warning klaxons in their helmets died abruptly. They drifted lightly with the gentle undercurrent, sinking half a meter toward the riverbed. The comms officer still had half his shoulder hung up on the electrified wire mesh. The trace amounts of toxin leaking through his compromised mask had already numbed half his face. His tactical land completely lost all life signs from the 3 assault troopers. With half his shoulder still snagged on the live wire, high-voltage current continued to drill through his exoskeleton and into his vascular system. Even his fingertips were twitching uncontrollably. The maniacal laughter of the humans on shore, combined with the splashes from the shotgun blasts, completely shattered the last remnants of his tactical composure. Mustering every last drop of motor control he had left, he dragged his one unparalyzed hand to his chest and popped the seal on his stealth armor, exposing his overheating infrasonic communication array. The Galactic Empire's absolute highest-tier orbital distress protocol required 3 layers of biometric keys. He dragged a trembling finger across the hot keypad. All 3 verification attempts timed out and threw errors. Completely bypassing the security lock, he used his barbed nail to physically pry open the casing and crush the manual trigger switch. A heavy, low-frequency pulse, completely undetectable to human hearing, detonated from his chest, radiating outward through the water in concentric rings. His helmet's signal indicator strobed frantically, desperately trying to punch through the triple barrier of the water column, the troposphere, and the ionosphere to hurl the SOS to the Imperial flagship in low orbit. 3 seconds later, every single upload progress bar flipped to glaring red failure codes. Earth's dense atmosphere suffocated the microwave signals entirely beneath the water. The max output infrasonics didn't escape an inch. They were completely trapped in the 30-foot-deep river, bouncing furiously against every layer of water like a swarm of hornets trapped in a mason jar. Decades of decaying leaves and mud on the riverbed were vibrated loose. Dense clusters of bubbles squeezed out from the mud seams, and the minnows and crawfish hiding in the rocks shot toward the surface in an absolute frenzy. Completely oblivious to the ecological chaos around him, the comms officer kept frantically hammering the transmit button on his infrasonic array. In the murky water, the violently churning sediment plastered itself against his mostly disabled stealth scales, leaving streaks of grayish-yellow grime. He completely failed to notice that the 1.5-foot thick layer of black mud right by his boots was boiling violently. 2 razor-sharp ridges of a spiked carapace had already scraped against his ankle bone, and a terrifying rage-filled biological pressure, smelling of river rot and dead fish, was already pressed dead against his chest. A massive 40-pound alligator snapping turtle, its shell completely caked in dark green ancient moss, blasted out of the churning mud like a blunt-nosed torpedo fired from the riverbed. Its iron vice jaws snapped open to the absolute limit, the razor-sharp keratin beak locking flawlessly onto the overheating casing of his infrasonic array. The instant that keratin beak clamped down, the comms officer's chest-mounted array shattered like cheap plastic. 1,200 pounds of bite force punched straight through the shattered casing and into his biomimetic chest plate. The waterproofing seal was instantly pulverized by the turtle's jaws. Sub-zero river water flooded the inner lining of his combat suit, mixing with leaking pale blue coolant and sending his one remaining functional half of his body into violent convulsions. Tactical sensors were instantly overwhelmed with pure agony. It completely eclipsed the sustained electrical numbness from the wire mesh. He kicked his limbs in a wild, uncontrollable panic, dragging the taut, galvanized wire mesh as he broke the mirror-like surface of the water with a massive splash, leaving half his body dangling in midair as icy water rained down. That 40-pound alligator snapper didn't show the slightest intention of letting go. The razor-sharp scoots on its shell sliced a fresh, bleeding gash into an old wound on his ankle, and its hook-like claws dug straight into the seams of his stealth armor, pulling him toward the bottom for dear life. The two opposing forces strained his zero-G optimized joints until they let out an ear-piercing metallic squeal. Overloaded nerve signals caused his helmet's external speakers to let out a totally distorted, blood-curdling shriek. The sonic wave swept across the water, making the silvery glass eels jump right out of the river. His desperate thrashing knocked the three paralyzed assault troopers wildly off balance in the water. Their partially visible bodies were now completely exposed under the blinding xenon lights. Neon green neurotoxin mixed with pale blue coolant, blooming into a bizarre, oily slick across the surface. He was in so much pain he nearly dislocated his remaining arm, his vision a blur of splashing water and blinding lights from the shore. Smith spat his Marlboro, burned down to the filter, right into the mud by his boots. He stared at the chaotic tangle of man and turtle thrashing in the water, a grin wrinkling his cheeks into deep canyons. He casually tapped the surface of the water with the barrel of his Remington, his gravelly voice easily overpowering the comms officer's distorted shrieks. "Would you look at that? These out-of-town poachers can't even handle a 30-year-old snapper. Should have figured out whose turf this was before you dipped your toes in." A few pissed-off fishermen next to him had already coiled their barbed tow cables. The thick, tar-soaked nylon ropes gleamed with a cold, oily sheen under the headlights, the barbed tips still sporting shredded moss from snagging driftwood. Old Tom stomped his empty beer can flat and was the first to whip a cable over the water. The barb bit into the stealth scale seams of the closest paralyzed trooper with a sharp crack. The rest of the crew instantly followed suit, whipping out 3 more lines that flawlessly snared the other motionless shadows. The final cable hooked cleanly around the waist of the comms officer wrestling the snapper, yanking him backwards so violently he nearly flung the turtle right off his chest. Smith tilted his chin, sweeping his gaze across the taut cables. Seeing the barbs were dug in deep with no chance of slipping, he took 2 steps back, his heavy rubber boots crushing the tiny glass eels wriggling in the mud. He eyed the 3 F-150s parked on the bank, watching as the fishermen expertly locked the cable clasps into the hydraulic winch hitches on their rear bumpers. Someone gave the lines a quick test tug and hollered in a gruff voice, "Chaise locked." Smith ground his molars. His greasy thumb grazed the edge of his sawed-off stock as he stepped up to the driver's side door of the center truck, extending his bark-like finger straight toward the red ignition switch of the winch. Lying face down in the muck, Zeth's scorched optic nerves first caught the low-frequency rumble of the hydraulic motors kicking in. Immediately after, an ear-splitting roar detonated from the undercarriages of all 8 pickups. The industrial zip ties binding his wrists bit another fraction of an inch into his exoskeleton with every uncontrollable muscle spasm. On his remaining half-shattered sensor screen, he watched the signal markers of his 4 subordinates, along with the massive, unidentifiable reptilian heat signature, barreling toward the shoreline at terrifying speed, tracing the trajectory of the cables. The taut, tar-soaked steel cables groaned on the verge of snapping. Muddy, half-meter waves exploded on the river's surface as the mud and weed-covered bodies were consecutively violently yanked out of the water. First up was the comms officer, still tangled in wire mesh, with that 40-pound alligator snapper refusing to unclamp from his chest array, its claws gouging deep trenches into his armor. Following close behind were the 3 paralyzed assault troopers, dragging like wet sandbags across the rocky riverbed. The mud and sand packed into their armor seams, leaving 3 distinct grayish-yellow trails in the water. Every single alarm in Zeth's helmet screamed at once. His final bar of reserve power was plummeting rapidly. He tried to issue a tactical abort command to stop the hauling, but his vocal synthesizer was already fried to slag. He couldn't emit a single bite of sound. Splashed with freezing river water, he could clearly feel 5 heavy bodies sequentially slamming onto the muddy bank, plowing 5 ankle-deep trenches through the muck. They skidded to a violent halt exactly half a meter in front of a dozen pairs of mud-caked rubber boots. The rumbling aftershocks of the F-150's hydraulic winches were still vibrating the shredded seaweed on the mudflat when Smith took the first step, his boot heel crushing a half-buried empty beer can. Over a dozen eel fishermen surged forward in a chaotic swarm. They swung the sawed-off stalks of their Remingtons with bone-crushing force, raining heavy blows down onto the helmets of the 4 freshly hauled aliens. Within half a minute, the already crippled operatives were beaten into twitching messes, completely stripped of the strength to even raise an arm. Someone whipped out a roll of heavy-duty zip ties. The thick ratchets clicked frantically, wrenching the aliens' wrists and ankles backward and hogtying them as tight as drumheads. They even slapped 3 extra zip ties around that 40-pound alligator snapper, binding it flush against the comms officer's chest plate to make damn sure it wasn't going anywhere, no matter how hard it bit down. Smith spat a wad of mud-speckled saliva. He squatted down and roughly dug through the seams of the aliens' combat suits. Hooking a finger around the neurotoxin projector on a trooper's wrist, he gave it a violent, downward yank. The damaged interface tore clean off, splashing pale green venom all over his muddy gloves. He tossed the cold metal device in his palm a couple of times. It had some serious weight to it. He shot a glance at his pissed-off crew, bellowing over the biting Maine ocean wind. These sons of bitches actually brought high-voltage stun guns to electrocute the fish. Face planted in the mud, Zeth forced his remaining half-bar of backup power directly into his long-destroyed vocal synthesizer. The overloaded chips immediately sparked with the faint smell of ozone. A piercing, high-frequency sonic wave, sharp enough to shatter algae cells, blasted through the cracks in his helmet. It was the Galactic Empire's highest-tier conqueror's declaration, a war cry frequency reserved exclusively for fleet commanders. He tried to tense his exoskeleton to prop up his upper body, but the heavy zip ties cutting into his armor seams only triggered a cascade of glaring red error codes. He didn't budge an inch. "I am Zeth, commander of the amphibious infiltration squad of the Galactic Empire," his synthetic voice violently distorted with static, rendering the supposedly majestic tone completely unrecognizable even to himself. "Release all Imperial combat personnel immediately in accordance with the interstellar rules of engagement and afford us formal prisoner of war status, or your home world will suffer an orbital-class slagging retaliation." Smith didn't pause for even a fraction of a second. He backhanded the solid metal neurotoxin projector straight down onto Zeth's exposed helmet, following it up instantly with a vicious, heavy-gloved slap. The strike drove the helmet a solid half-inch deeper into the muck, instantly suffocating Zeth's last semi-functional edge sensor probes in black mud. "Shut your damn mouth. Soon as I sell Tonight's catch, haulin' your asses straight to the county lockup." Zeth's core logic board short-circuited wildly from the blunt force trauma. His backup power percentage went into a freefall, instantly plummeting to the critical 5% red line. Through his blurry sensory feed, he watched his 4 subordinates piled up on the mudflat like unsorted cargo. That 40-pound alligator snapper was still zip-tied directly to the trooper's chest, leisurely swishing its spiked tail. The dozen eel fishermen were wrapping up their work, dragging this heavy string of hog-tied catches toward a parked refrigerated box truck nearby. Smith's boot heel crushed a half-buried empty beer can, emitting a sharp crunch. He slipped on a thick, grease-stained cotton glove, grabbed the metal handle of the refrigerated truck, and yanked downward. The rusted back door popped open with a screech, leaving a 1.5 foot wide gap. A blast of 14-degree air, reeking of ancient frozen trash fish, slammed into his face. Frowning, he spat a glob of muddy saliva onto the ground and hollered at the dozen guys dragging the alien bundles behind him, "Hustle up and shove 'em in. And don't scratch my damn paint job. Once we flip the catch tonight, buyin' a whole case of ice-cold beer for everyone." The poachers chuckled, hauling on the thick cables threaded through the zip ties of the 5 aliens. They dragged them toward the door like a bundled stack of firewood. The 40-pound alligator snapper, still refusing to release the comms officer's array, dragged its claws through the alien armor seams as it slid right into the truck, hitting the ice-covered floorboards with a heavy thud. Dull thuds echoed in rapid succession as the fishermen literally kicked the 3 paralyzed assault troopers into the rig, sending them tumbling haphazardly into a pile of rock, hard, frozen fish. Finally, Smith walked over, grabbed the tangled mesh of the fine dip net still wrapped around Zeth's helmet, and relied entirely on sheer arm strength to hoist the elite alien infiltration commander off the ground like a dead chicken. With a massive swing, he chucked Zeth deep into the back of the truck. Zeth's helmet slammed against the metal interior wall with a hollow clang, the leaking red error light flickering but refusing to die. Smith leaned his upper body into the cab, shoving the tangled pile of aliens a couple of times to make absolutely sure all 5 bodies and the alligator snapper were packed in tight. Stepping back, he grabbed the heavy door handle with both gloved hands and threw his weight into slamming the door shut. The back of Zeth's head smashed solidly against a stack of rock, hard frozen herring. Before he could even recover from the dizzying impact, sub-zero air laced with the stench of dead fish aggressively flooded in through the closing gap. Clang! The half-ton steel doors slammed shut. The brass teeth of the padlock bit flawlessly into the latch, the crisp, metallic snap rattling through the steel plates and vibrating Zeth's remaining helmet sensors into a state of numbness. The residual river water trapped in his scale seams instantly began to freeze. The biomimetic scales, previously capable of adaptive angle adjustment, popped and cracked like shattering glass before seizing up completely, taking the entire stealth armor system offline. He tried to test the wrist restraints, but his precision exoskeleton joints instantly threw a localized mechanical error. The extreme cold had turned his hydraulic transmission fluid into a semi-solid paste. He couldn't flex a single millimeter. Beside him, the alien comms officer emitted fizzing static noises. The 40-pound snapper clinging to his chest plate had pulled its claws in tight and stopped moving entirely, the water droplets on its shell freezing into a translucent crust of ice, yet it still hadn't let go. The mud splattered across the 3 paralyzed assault troopers was now frozen solid, the residual neon green venom in their projectors congealing into a harmless jelly in the freezing temperatures, completely neutralizing any threat of a leak. Muffled noises from outside bled through the thick steel plates. It was Smith's gruff laughter, mixed with another poacher complaining over a stream of curses. Got a full 20 pounds of glass eels tonight. If that son of a bitch at the docks tries to lowball me to 1800, welding his freezer door shut with him inside. Zeth threw everything he had at his power units, but he couldn't lift a single biomimetic finger, a fraction of a millimeter. His remaining 5% reserve battery was draining wildly in the 14-degree cold. His estimated operational lifespan nosedived from 3 minutes straight to 27 seconds. Suddenly, the half-wrecked Starlink comms module on the side of his helmet, courtesy of Smith's shotgun stock, caught an infinitesimally weak ionospheric reflection signal leaking through the metal seams of the refrigerated truck. The microwave frequencies, previously dead, stopped by 30 feet of fresh water, were somehow bouncing erratically off the steel chassis just enough to graze the Imperial flagship's receiver array in low Earth orbit. Zeth's core logic board flashed a frantic red warning. Completely bypassing all safety protocols, he dumped every last microamp of his reserve power directly into the comms module's transmission loop. The diesel rumble of the pickup truck engines vibrated up through the chassis. Smith's raspy voice filtered faintly through the half-inch steel doors. "Check your nets. Lock the coolers in the passenger seats. Soon as I flip this haul, dragging these wetsuit-wearing poachers to the scrapyard to sell 'em for their scrap aluminum weight. Might at least cover my gas money. Oh, and that turtle bitten the walkie-talkie. Taking that bastard home and stewing it to go with the bourbon I saved from last week." The fishermen erupted into laughter, the stocks of their shotguns clanging sharply against the metal tailgates of the pickups. Zeth's final sliver of processing power burned white-hot. He compiled every scrap of tactical telemetry he had gathered, the tensile strength of the dipnet fibers, The ratcheting lockdown mechanism of the industrial zip ties, the raw output voltage of the electrostatic wire mesh, and a complete high-res 3D scan of that 40-pound alligator snapper's bite force. He compressed it all into a single data packet. Just 1 second before his battery flatlined, he successfully hurled that warning across 42 light-years. Earth's waterways have been entirely locked down by a species of fiercely territorial, heavily armed and psychotic bipedal natives who are prepared to fight to the death at a moment's notice. The Imperial Infiltration Protocol has failed. Under no circumstances approach the Maine war zone. A split second before his final optical sensor blacked out completely, a blurred data stream transmitted a visual back from orbit. The Supreme Commander of the Galactic Empire, his hand hovering over the launch button for the orbital drop shock troopers, was staring at a high-definition photograph of a moss-covered turtle stubbornly refusing to let go of a shattered comms array. His knuckles were bone white, completely paralyzed with fear, unable to press the button. 8 Ford F-150s, belching pale blue diesel exhaust, fell into a tight convoy. They rumbled down the coastal gravel roads of Maine, their headlights carving through the 2 a.m. fog, lighting the entire route to the docks as bright as day. Across this entire stretch of freshwater river, where glass eels sold for $2 a pound, not a single footprint of a Galactic Empire conqueror was left behind.
Hell yeah! Did you see those high-tech squid faces getting dragged by F-150s and chewed on by a 40-pound snapper? That's what happens when you try to poach Maine glass eels on Old Man Smith's turf. Absolute badass. Now, let me ask you guys, if a bunch of fancy alien invaders ever crash land in your hometown, what kind of redneck garbage or old junk would you use to welcome them? Drop your comments below. Smash that like button and subscribe for more crazy stories. See ya!